Che Guevara has become synonymous with rebellion and revolution, but few know the true violent reality behind this ruthless, bloodthirsty insurgent. For decades, the very iconic and famous photograph originally taken by Alberto Corda, called Heroic Guerrilla Fighter, has adorned thousands of articles of clothing. But how much of the truth do these garment wearers actually know about the famous guerrilla fighter? Most sensible people would not want to support a homophobic, racist, homicidal individual. But that is exactly the kind of man that Guevara was. This is the story of Che Guevara. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Before I begin, I want to note that there are some quotes in here that contain terms that are considered to be offensive. I want to state that this is in no way a reflection of my own beliefs, but of those who wrote/said the original quote. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Che Guevara was born Ernesto Guevara de la Serna on June 14, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina. He was the eldest of 5 children in a middle-class family. He came from Spanish and Irish descent, and politically, his family had leftist leanings. While he was growing up, he would often hear arguments and conversations about the Spanish Civil War. Guevara's father would frequently host veterans at his home. Overhearing these political values and information shaped young Guevara's worldview on politics. Despite suffering from asthma, Guevara was actually an excellent athlete and scholar. He was intelligent, he liked chess, poetry, math, political science, and archaeology. He was known to voraciously read his father's books, researching everything from Nietzsche to Aristotle, and Karl Marx had a huge impact on him as he later held up Marxism in high regard. In his teens, he started to become politically active, absorbing the leftist teachings of his family. Guevara ended up joining a group that opposed Juan Perón. Perón had created a political movement called Peronism, the idea being to have the state take a role in the economy so that there would be cooperation between businesses and laborers. I also think it's important to mention that Guevara's cousin, Albert Benegas Lynch Jr., had wrote an article called My Cousin El Che, and had mentioned that when Guevara was younger, he found delight and enjoyment in torturing animals. However, I did not find this in any other source. I do find this particularly interesting, as we can see by his actions later on, because according to the psychiatrist J.M. MacDonald, who had published his review in 1963, he stated that there are 3 signs that indicate if someone will grow up to become a serial killer or a violent criminal. Those are setting fires, regularly wetting the bed, and torturing and abusing animals. In 1950, Guevara ended up going to medical school at the University of Buenos Aires, but he found himself wanting to explore the world. His first journey was solo, where he traveled 2,800 miles through northern Argentina, particularly the rural provinces. After his solo trip, he and his friend Alberto Granado in 1951 went on a 9-month-long journey through Latin America while he was on hiatus from medical school. The trip was 5,000 miles. They started on a motorcycle called the Powerful, which ended up breaking down early and they had to abandon the vehicle. He and Granado traveled from Argentina to Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, through the Andes, the Atacama Desert, and the Chiquimata copper mines, and the area surrounding Machu Picchu. Then Guevara later flew to Miami without Granado. During that time, he found his worldview significantly changed, which he wrote his experiences in a journal. He witnessed many people living in terrible, poor conditions, and after his trip, he returned to medical school, determined to provide care for those in need. In Peru, he had originally intended to go to Iquitos, but ended up in Lima, where there was a very busy hospital that was lacking the proper care needed to give attention to those who started to recover. He volunteered for 6 months at Portada de Gaia, that was located in the neighborhood of Piñonate in San Martin de Porres, as he helped individuals who were suffering from Hansen's disease, which is more commonly known as leprosy. It is a dangerous and life-threatening condition if it is not treated. The symptoms affect the nerves, the skin, and mucous membranes. The reality of seeing these needy and suffering people is what ultimately helped change and form Guevara's worldviews. In 2003, his family posthumously published the journal, calling it the Motorcycle Diaries, Notes on a Latin American Journey. The next year, it was adapted into a film called The Motorcycle Diaries, starring Gael Garcia Bernal as Che Guevara. Guevara completed his medical studies in 1953 and he traveled to Guatemala. He had started to lose interest in his medical studies, and instead Guevara became more interested in the idea that revolution could bring massive change and justice to those suffering in South America. During that time, Jacobo Arbenz was heading a progressive regime and attempting to bring about a social revolution. This was around the time that Guevara got his nickname of Che, as it is the sound that Argentines use to punctuate their speech with the interjection Che. Guevara ended up touring around Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. His journey took him through the United Fruit Company land that Arbenz was trying to redistribute to the peasants. Guevara ended up meeting up with high-level officials in Arbenz government as well as Cuban exiles. He became an ally of Arbenz. At this time, the CIA had been actively trying to overthrow Arbenz. They were using propaganda techniques to try and remove him from power. In 1954, the regime of Arbenz was thrown over by a coup supported by the CIA, as they had convinced Guevara that the United States doesn't support leftist governments. This made room for CIA-backed Castillo Armas to come to power in Guatemala. This caused Guevara to feel a great deal of disdain for the United States government. Guevara started to make plans to bring about socialism by means of a massive worldwide revolution. He became a dedicated Marxist in Guatemala. Marxism comes from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels around the mid-19th century. It has 3 ideas: philosophical anthropology, a theory of history, and an economic and political program. This basis of thought later helped develop the theory and practice of communism. In 1955, Guevara moved on to Mexico, where he got married to Hilda Gadea Acosta. During this time, he would work in a hospital and give lectures. He later met Fidel and Raul Castro, brothers that had been politically exiled when they had been planning to overthrow Fulgencio Batista, the dictator of Cuba. Guevara ended up joining Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement in 1953. They had led a raid on Moncada Army barracks in the city of Santiago de Cuba. Most of their group was killed. The Castro brothers escaped, but were later arrested and imprisoned. Guevara, who had managed to escape, would later converse with subsistence farmers that were in poverty. Guevara, in order to help them out, would create grenade factories, build bread ovens, establish clinics, and set up schools for literacy. I think it is important to discuss the history of Cuba and how the Cuban Revolution came to be. In 1902, after the Spanish-American War, Cuba became a republic, its main commercial export being sugar. In 1925, Gerardo Machado was elected as president. There had been a great deal of governmental corruption in Cuba and a financial crisis as well. Machado promised reform to the island, but he ended up becoming Cuba's first dictator. In 1933, he was driven out by Fulgencio Batista. Several presidents came and went during that time, but Batista remained a force in the government. He ended up serving as president from 1940 to 1944 and ran for a second term in 1952. He was on the verge of losing, and so in response, he overthrew the government and canceled upcoming elections. On December 2, 1956, 82 men, including Guevara, landed in Oriente, a Cuban province. They sailed in on a small yacht called the Granma. Fulgencio Batista's army had detected the men and wiped almost all of them out. The Castro brothers survived, as well as Guevara, but he was injured. He made his way to the Sierra Maestra, where the center of the guerrilla army began. The rebels started to gather weapons, seizing them from Batista's forces and gaining strength and numbers in the form of new recruits. The rebellion started to take out attacks on government facilities as well as sugar plantations. Meanwhile, Batista started to crack down on anyone they thought was associating or collaborating with Castro. Guevara started out as the force's doctor, but he also had training using weapons and had become one of Fidel Castro's most trusted aides. Guevara would frequently act as executioner or would order the death of suspected traitors and deserters of the rebel army. During this time, he wrote about how Batista's government was being overturned in a book called Reminiscence of the Cuban Revolutionary War. Due to the rebellion force that was growing, Batista, in response, had taken away constitutional rights to Cubans, such as freedom of speech and assembly, and the next year he continued to suspend the presidential election, blaming the rebellion and their violence for his actions. Guevara founded Rebel Radio in February 1958. He was considered by the CIA to be the brain of Castro, due to him often overseeing executions of those who deserted the rebel force and who were spying on them. Guevara recognized the widespread effect radio could have and how vital that could be for broadcasting the revolutionaries' cause. Cuba was starting to kill rebels on sight if they were found or captured. In return, the rebels were continuously launching ambushes against Batista's government. Batista, under the assumption that the support for the rebellion was wavering, called a major military offense against the rebellion in summer of 1958. The rebels were able to quickly fight back, causing the army to be forced to withdraw. The United States began to withdraw support of Batista's government. They had previously backed him up due to his anti-communist stance. In November 1958, the Cuban presidential election was back on, and there was widespread fraud. Batista's chosen successor having won, rather than another candidate that received legitimate votes. In December of 1958, the revolutionaries defeated the Cuban army in the Battle of Santa Clara, and they captured a train that had ammunition and weapons. Over 2,000 had died during those 2 years of revolution. Batista was forced to flee Cuba on January 1, 1959, where he fled to Portugal and spent the rest of his life there in exile until he passed away in 1973. 7 days later, on January 8, 1959, Castro's troops entered Havana victoriously. Guevara worked at the La Cabaña prison during that time, where he oversaw executions of individuals who were thought to be enemies of the rebels and the revolution. There is an estimation that 144 individuals were executed without trial under his orders, but with all the sources I used, I couldn't pin down an exact number other than it was likely over 100 individuals that were executed. He became a Cuban citizen and a prominent part of the Marxist government that had been newly established. Guevara would represent Cuba on many different commercial missions. He also started to become known for his opposition to imperialism, neocolonialism, and his attacks against U.S. foreign policy. Guevara also served as the chief of the industrial department of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, and he served as president of the National Bank of Cuba and also the Minister of Industry. He started to move the trade relations between Cuba and the United States to the Soviet Union instead. Castro started to implement a communist regime, and it was around that time that the United States pulled out of supporting Cuba, as they were also starting to forge ties with the Soviet Union, and that was the United States' enemy at the time. Castro started to confiscate private property, which several were owned by North American interests, and Guevara worked to cut off financial ties with the majority of the Western world. He had started to work on land reform laws in Cuba. He also started to form financial relationships with nations that were part of the Eastern Bloc, but this proved to be not very ideal. For those who don't know, according to Britannica.com, the Eastern Bloc was a group of Eastern European countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union from right after the Second World War to 1990. The members included Albania, Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. This was also a time when Guevara divorced his first wife, Hilda Acosta, and married Alida March not too long after their divorce. Guevara would go on to have a total of 5 children with both women. In 1960, Eisenhower had passed legislation that stopped the U.S. from purchasing sugar from Cuba. Eventually, all exports to Cuba had an embargo put on them except for food and medicine. In 1961, the U.S. broke off ties with Cuba completely. Since May of 1960, the CIA had been planning on invading, and once John Kennedy was elected president, the plan was approved. On April 15, 1961, 3 planes that were ironically piloted by Cubans that had been trained by the U.S. had bombed Cuban air bases. 2 days later, the Cubans working for the U.S. had their principal landing at the Bay of Pigs. However, Castro's army was stronger, and the U.S. stronghold had been captured along with 1,100 men. The captured men were imprisoned, and for the next several years, the United States worked to raise ransom to free the prisoners. As reparations, Castro demanded $28 million of heavy construction equipment. The United States was unable to provide that, and so the ransom went back and forth and changed several times over the months. Eventually, Castro settled on letting the prisoners go for $53 million of food and medicine. Between December 1962 and July of 1965, the prisoners were slowly released to the United States. This all ended up leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the political leaders of the U.S. and Cuba were engaged in a 13-day military political standoff in October 1962. The belief was that the Soviet Union had installed nuclear-armed missiles on Cuba that were pointed to U.S. soil, which was just 90 miles south of Florida. On October 22nd, JFK held a press conference that told Americans about these missiles and that a blockade was being erected around Cuba. He said that if they had to use military force to neutralize the threat, then they would do what was necessary. Nikita Khrushchev, the first Secretary of Soviet Union, later offered to remove the Cuban missiles with the agreement that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Guevara traveled to the United States to New York City on December 11, 1964. In an address to the United Nations General Assembly, he condemned the U.S.'s intervention in Cuban affairs and going into Cuban airspace. He also expressed support of the citizens of Puerto Rico and condemned the apartheid that was happening in South Africa. In 1965, Guevara dropped out of the public eye. He had become disillusioned with the way that the revolution was going in Cuba and the reliance of Cuba on the Soviets. He wanted to use the idea of rebellion in other countries. For 6 months, Guevara was out of the sight of public view, and it wasn't until Fidel Castro had revealed that he had a letter from Guevara that said that he was renouncing his official post. He said in the letter that he had left Cuba to, quote, Fight imperialism in new fields of battle. I have fulfilled the part of my duty that has tied me to the Cuban Revolution. And I say goodbye to you, to the comrades, to your people who are now mine." End quote. Guevara's whereabouts became a guessing game internationally. There were some who said that they had seen him in Addis Ababa and Dar es Salaam, and others that say that they had spotted him in Vietnam. Guevara was actually in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he and the other Cuban guerrilla fighters attempted to help the Patrice Lumumba battalion that was attempting to fight a civil war there. Lumumba was an African nationalist leader and became the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. In June to September 1960, he was against dividing the country along racial or regional lines. He supported Pan-Africanism, which is an ideology that people of African descent should have common interests and be unified. Lumumba wanted to liberate colonial territories. He wanted to reject any sort of imported ideology, including that of the Soviets. During that time in the Congo, Guevara resigned from the Cuban government and renounced his citizenship. However, the rebellion was a failure as he could not seem to transfer his rebellious ideologies to the Congo. And Guevara fled to Tanzania and then later to a safe house in Prague. He returned to Argentina, determined to bring revolution to his native country. Neither the Argentine Communist Party nor Castro thought that this was a good idea, and Castro had been one to encourage Guevara to go to Bolivia to incite revolution there. In autumn 1966, Guevara traveled to Bolivia. He had shaved his beard and his hair and was going incognito. He was planning on creating another guerrilla group in Santa Cruz. While they did have some success, they later found themselves on the run from the Bolivian army. Guevara claimed that he had wanted, quote, to turn the Bolivian Andes into another Sierra Maestra, end quote. The guerrilla group was nearly wiped out by the Bolivian army, aided by the CIA on October 8, 1967, and about 1,800 of the Bolivian special forces had surrounded his encampment and battled it out with the rebel fighters. In Guevara's journal, he wrote, quote, Bolivia, July 1967. The negative aspects prevail, including the failure to make contact with the outside. We are down to 22 men, 3 of whom are disabled, including myself, end quote. Guevara had been wounded in the attack and was suffering from acute asthma and dysentery. While there, Guevara was waiting for word from Castro and he received nothing. According to journalist Georgie Ann Geyer, who had also investigated Guevara's death, she said that Castro, quote, could have sent someone up from Paraguay. He could have sent someone out from La Paz, the capital. There was no contact. Che is left wandering in this very high, wild jungle, end quote. Guevara's biographer, Jorge Castaneda, added that, quote, Fidel did not send Che to his death in Bolivia. He simply allowed history to run its course, end quote. Guevara was captured in a ravine called El Hierro on October 8, 1967. While being interrogated, he was not cooperating and was often being defiant. The next day, Bolivian President René Barrientos ordered the execution of Guevara. The United States had not wanted him executed. They had wanted him extradited to Panama for more interrogation, but the plan was set in motion anyway. Without trial, he was paraded in front of Bolivian soldiers before they shot him in the chest, killing him at the age of 39. Guevara himself had previously said, quote, we cannot be sure of having something to live for unless we are willing to die for it, end quote. Before the Bolivian army buried him, they allegedly took a picture of his body on a stone slab and cut off his hands and preserved them in formaldehyde so that later his fingerprints could confirm his identity. Although I only found that in one source, so I don't know how true that story is. On October 12th, the American State Department analyzed Guevara's death and said that, quote, Guevara will be eulogized as the model revolutionary who met a heroic death, One of the biographers of Guevara, named John Lee Anderson, claimed that the body of Guevara and several of his comrades had been buried in Valle Grande in central Bolivia in a mass grave. In 1997, the body and his comrades were disinterred and brought to Cuba to be interred in a memorial/monument in Santa Clara. In 2008, on the 80th anniversary of his birth, there was a statue erected in Rosario, Argentina, which was his hometown. However, there has been a great deal of angry disputes from Argentinians about his life and what he had done during his time on Earth. Guevara has created quite a legacy, although it seems like his romanticized image has left many in the dark about his murderous, cruel, and brutal ways. His face adorns countless t-shirts and posters. The picture that usually adorns these items was a photograph taken by Alberto Korda on March 5, 1960. The picture was taken at a ceremony for an arms ship that had brought weapons to Havana. Guevara still remains to this day a symbol of rebellion, and through time he has become more of an abstract figure rather than known as the bloody figure that he was when he was alive. I think it is important to talk about the bloody and violent side of his legacy. Guevara was known for being a brutal killer, and the Cuban newspaper Revolution had reported that Guevara had spoke about the killings, saying, quote, "In times of excessive tension, we cannot proceed weakly. At the Sierra Maestra, we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. At times, the revolutions cannot stop to conduct much investigation. It has the obligation to triumph." End quote. He also spoke in his own diary, quote, "I see it printed in the night sky. I, howling like one possessed, will assault the barricades or the trenches. Will take my blood-stained weapon and consumed with fury, slaughter any enemy who falls into my hands." End quote. He even told a story about how he had killed a peasant that had allegedly leaked information to the enemy. Guevara wrote, quote, "He gasped for a little while and was dead. To execute a human being is something ugly, but also exemplary." End quote. Maria Verlo, author of the book Che Guevara's Forgotten Victims, had said that, quote, "He was directly responsible for at least 124 killings." End quote. Guevara was also responsible for a system that put homosexual people into labor camps. Humberto Fontova, author of Exposing the Real Che Guevara, had told Fox News that, quote, "The regime that Che Guevara had co-founded is the only one in modern history in the Western Hemisphere to have herded gays into forced labor camps." End quote. These camps were set up for people who were viewed as delinquents by the state. They were forced to work 60 hours a week with little pay and were guarded by men with guns. The concentration camp was located in Guanajuato in 1960, which adapted the Auschwitz motto of "work sets you free," but changed it slightly to "work will make you men." Homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Afro-Cuban priests that were believed to have committed crimes against the morals of the revolution were forced to work in these camps. The idea was to correct their antisocial behavior. Many died, many were tortured or raped. Guevara would often refer to these gay individuals as, quote, "sexual perverts," end quote. And he said that, quote, "a deviation of that nature clashes with the concept of what we have of what a militant communist should be," end quote. Guevara did also not believe in free press. He thought that newspapers were instruments of the oligarchy. He often made racist statements too. In his diary, he spoke of, quote, "the blacks," end quote, that were living in Caracas, Venezuela. He said, quote, "those magnificent examples of the African race who have maintained their racial purity thanks to their lack of affinity with bathing. The black is an indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity or drink. The European has a tradition of working and saving," end quote. Of the execution of Batista's army, Humberto Fontova said that, quote, many of the people that Che was sending to the firing squad were members of Batista's army, and these proportionately tended to be black and mulatto. Batista himself was mulatto, end quote. Batista was considered to be a friend of the black minority by many Cubans of that time. Fontova went on to say that, quote, the lily-white Che Guevara and Fidel Castro overthrew the mixed-race Batista, end quote. Although there are some that say that Guevara called for more black individuals to be represented in institutions and wanted more black fighters under his command. Guevara also had a messiah complex. He believed that he was some sort of savior and that he was absolved the bloodshed that he had caused. He wrote in his diary one night while talking to a fellow comrade that he had a moment of clarity. He said, quote, I now knew that when the great guiding spirit cleaves humanity into two antagonistic halves, I would be with the people. I see myself, the great equalizer of individual will, proclaiming the ultimate mea culpa. I feel my nostrils dilate, savoring the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood, the enemy's death. I steel my body, ready to do battle and prepare myself to be a sacred space within which the bestial howl of the triumphant proletariat can resound. End quote. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Meyers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.